This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Next, Professor Ben Kaczynski from our fantastic Goizeta Business School, right across the streets here. Yeah, oh, we've got some fans in the audience.
SOBs,
Right.
students of Ben.
Next to Ben is Ian Fitch from TransferNet.io. Next to Ian is our banker. We have one banker on the panel. We had to get a banker here for this discussion. Joe from Morgan Stanley. Next to Joe is Mikhail, who also is a founder of a company, Try Mining. He just told me last night, I have to remember. Next to Joe is Rich. We just heard from Rich. Fabulous remarks. Thank you, Rich. Next to Rich is Renus with Monetizer, which is not a local company, but Monetizer, yeah, yay, is a graduate from Techstars. So they went through the Techstars program, and he can talk a lot about that. And at the end, our government guy, our gentleman, Dr. Tom Seville from the CDC, to tell us about the fantastic stuff that we're doing in public health and blockchain. With that, I'm going to move out the way. So our moderator, Mr. Jason Cross, who is also a founder, CEO, he sort of wears a lot of hats. He's got a PhD, a JD, and he's doing stuff in sort of a consulting role for companies, connecting them using blockchain technology. Is that good? Fair? All right. I'm moving off.
Thank you, Professor Morris and the law school for bringing us all together for this exciting event. Before I start throwing curveballs at the panelists, I'll just say a few things. One, blockchain changes everything, or will, and I'd like to kind of share 3 points on how. One is following Rich's revival of our memories of the early day of the internet. We go back 25 years. I'd like us all to recall that, while for some engineers the term internet meant something very narrow, essentially the expansion of DARPANet, the way it impacted our lives was a cluster of interrelated technologies, right? So the network itself, but also the modems that allowed for more parties to connect, different protocols like the World Wide Web, browser technology, evolution in server technology, et cetera. And so similarly, I'd like to encourage us to think of blockchain as the cluster of distributed ledger technology, hash cryptography, managed differential data access, so we can all have dibs to see different parts of a data set. You can have need-to-know access, self-executing smart contracts, tokenized system management and governance, which we'll hopefully talk a little bit about, and where necessary, because it's not always necessary, crypto assets, whether cryptocurrencies, currencies that are treated as securities or in different jurisdictions, classified not as securities, but really, redeemable utility rewards that you can use to get stuff. And again, thinking back to the early days of the internet, some of how it's changed our lives has been radically new capabilities and experiences that we couldn't have had before. But a lot of it was doing stuff we did before better, right? Faster, higher quality, cheaper. And I would say the way it's actually affected our lives the most, though, is by enabling the viability and scalability of business model innovation. So new ways of reaching customers, creating value, generating revenues, distributing value that, strictly speaking, weren't dependent on the internet, but the internet enabled the overcoming of barriers to implementation and to scaling, and presto, Amazon's a bookstore in the mid-90s, but it's a very different kind of bookstore. And today it's everything. Second point on this topic of new business models is I'd like to encourage you to think about how blockchain can overcome barriers in innovative business models when it comes to operations and financing, right? So de-risking new new ways of approaching a market that at the moment might be too difficult to finance, or there might not be enough capital out there to prime the pump. And especially for young entrepreneurs out there, I encourage you to look at the social impact challenges of the world right now, because I believe, one, there's a lot of positive impact to have there. They're gold mines, though. Because if we think about barriers to business model innovations that blockchain can help overcome, if you've got enough money to throw at a problem and your customer base is in a rich country, et cetera, then the old business model, it might be tweaked a little bit and presto. A $100,000 drug that saves an insurer $1 million, that can work because the US insurer can pay for it. The Latin American or African insurer would benefit from that value prop, and they know it. They just don't have the cash in the bank to do that, right? So I think especially the emerging markets and the great social impact challenges of the age are where the main stakeholders are cash and credit poor, are also tremendous business opportunities I encourage the next generation to take on. And work with us at Agraria Technologies or compete with us. I'm all for competition to go out and compete to make the world a better place. I'm chairman now of a new company, Agraria Technologies, that sits in this middle space between amazing technologists that are having billions thrown at them through ICOs and VCs to create fascinating new capabilities, and the social innovators on the front lines in Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America that are incredibly creative on how to change markets and create new public-private partnership structures and so forth, but they're close to viability, but they just have certain barriers that can't cross over. Or they've been operating at a small scale for 10 years. They just can't scale. Right? And that's what we do at Agraria. We're working on climate change with partners in Southeast Asia by making sustainable agriculture more profitable than slash and burn. We're working with partners in Africa to make clean energy scalable, especially in shanty towns and villages with microgrids. We're working with partners in Asia and Latin America to expand access to high-impact medicines that the pharma commercials are right when they tell us it's going to save you money in the long run. But these markets, these ministries of health, they just don't have the money in the budget, right? So there's new innovations in healthcare finance and impact monitoring and stuff that can really enable broader access. We're working with partners in the international trade sector on ways to use blockchain to de-risk cross-border complex transactions that are going to have the biggest impact in emerging markets where the cost of capital and risk is highest. So on that point, I'm going to ask each member of the panel to briefly tell us who they are, a couple minutes of where they sit in the blockchain space as business leaders, entrepreneurs, technologists, or academics, and then I'm going to start tossing some curveball questions that'll be fun for all of us, and we will have time for audience to step to the mics and ask your questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kel?
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Kel Canty, and I'm co-founder of Verity. This is actually my second startup in the Bitcoin blockchain space. Initially, got into Bitcoin back in 2012 and founded a company in 2013 called CoinPliance. That was based for doing KYC, AML, and regulatory software to help Bitcoin be more accepted by governmental agencies and to help the adoption. It was on the Bitcoin Foundation Regulatory Affairs Committee, and we had a couple of large clients, but in general, back in 2013, the demand for regulation within the environment was not high. Plus, there's a lot of struggling by the governmental agencies, and there still is, with what exactly terms and regulations apply. There's been a couple of circulars from FinCEN and IRS, and that's been about the extent of it. We took some of the work that we worked on at CoinPliance and founded Verity back in 2016, and we're concentrating on doing the accounting and audit integrations and making sure that you can bridge the traditional financial worlds into blockchain assets. When I say blockchain assets, I mean tokens, cryptocurrencies, and any other things that can be representative value on the blockchain, such as tokenized mortgage loans or representative tokens that represent art, as well as currencies such as Bitcoin or ICO tokens that represent private currency, which is a really innovative, great way of democratization of the crowdfunding purposes, as was mentioned earlier. So we're here in Atlanta. We're based out of Georgia Tech's ATDC, the Advanced Technology Development Center. We've just closed a seed round, and we're actually looking for engineers, if you know any Node.js people. Glad to answer any other questions in regard to the space that we're in. But I will say that having been in the industry for a long time, I'm firmly convinced that blockchain is going to change the world. However, I think the current cycle of enthusiasm is kind of like what Bill Gates said once, is that technologists think they tend to overestimate what they can do in a year and underestimate what they can do in 10. And I think we're along that pathway, and I think if you wait 10 years and look back, it's going to be a very interesting picture.
I want to say hey to the SOBs, students of Ben, that are out there. And I'm here to raise the average age of the group. But I wanted to offer a couple of comments from an academic perspective. In part because this is a nexus of technologies that was born of mistrust, and a lot of what we're talking about is changing patterns of trust and association. There's a lot of disintermediation going on, mistrust of traditional institutions, the extra sovereign nature, extra sovereign agent and institution nature, don't trust banks, don't. So a lot of what has happened since 2009 has been the creation of bodies of nexus of different technologies that are fostering that democratization that Kel was talking about, but also it was born of a pattern of mistrust to create a new pattern of trust. And that's much more efficient. I study interorganizational systems, and a lot of this is about new markets and new exchanges. The stock issue exchange that was discussed are clearly examples of that as well. So I look at it from a standpoint of new patterns of intermediation and disintermediation in markets, but also preservation of pattern of trust, because you've got provenance and records. So there are no industries that are immune from these impacts, because it is about asset and event management. And therefore, it's interesting to us from that standpoint. And since Kel did a commercial, I would be ashamed to mention that on February 22nd, across the street at the business school, running a panel on health futures on AI and blockchain in healthcare in the evening, but I won't mention that because then Nicole would be upset.
Hi, I'm Ian Fish. I'm CEO of EQ Games and TransferNet. EQ Games, we do slot machines for Class 3 regulated markets in Vegas and also unregulated gray markets in a variety of states. We also have about 40 games on Steam, including Road Redemption, our biggest one. But I'm here today to talk about TransferNet, which is our blockchain project. And the idea is, how many of you guys are familiar with BitTorrent? You can just raise your hand. Well, look at that. That is a lot. So, one of the problems with BitTorrent is there's a huge supply-demand mismatch between the files people want and what's available, because it's a completely voluntary system. There's no incentive to share files other than out of the goodness of your heart, or badness of your heart, whatever you want to say. So it's a real use case for blockchain. I think 99% of the use cases I hear about don't really make sense for a blockchain, because they don't really need to be decentralized, they don't really need to be trustless, and even if they would benefit from being trustless, there are a lot of points in trust that, whenever you interact with the real world, you bring that trust into it, kind of defeats the purpose of a blockchain. But when you're talking about incentivizing file sharing in a peer-to-peer way, it needs to be tamper-proof, it needs to be immutable in some ways or another, but mostly it needs to be censorship-proof and trustless. And this is something that will we try to shut down from many different angles, and if there's a central point of failure, like you had with Napster, it will fail. But with blockchain technology, you really have that decentralization, censorship-proof, where it can't be shut down, even if the creators want it to be shut down. So TransferNet.io, we really think is a perfect use case for blockchain technology. It also has an anonymity component similar with the way Tor works with onion routing. How many of you guys are familiar with Tor? Still a lot. Very, very cool. So that's another part that we're also trying to incentivize. It's a little bit more complicated because normally with an open market like for files, you can compete with lowest price. But when you're talking about anonymity, you can't because the lowest price will always be a government trying to de-anonymize people. So it's a little bit more complicated, but that's another component to the project. So TransferNet.io.
Morning, my name is Joe Faxio. I'm with Morgan Stanley. And in order to do this panel, I had to agree to go through this entire presentation, so give me 1 second. There's a lot of charts in here and data and information, so for compliance purposes, I went through the presentation. If you'd like to see it, I can get up there. Okay. No, I'm dead serious. I had to go through that. So I'm working representing Morgan Stanley. Obviously, we are the old guard in the finance space, right? And so I will probably be one of the lead, what's the word? I'm not going to say the bad guy, but my perspective is going to be a little different because our goal is, what we do is we manage clients' assets. And so we try to get the most amount of reward with the lowest amount of risk. And, we'll tend to take that risk part pretty seriously. And given all the news on cryptocurrency, let me say this to kind of summarize some of the main points here. We definitely believe in blockchain technology. We believe there's a lot of business opportunities coming in that. Matter of fact, there's a white paper we did recently putting the question is, will blockchain increase is there an energy play because of blockchain, right? So we're big on that. We are hesitant and we see a lot of risk inherent in the cryptocurrency trading right now. And one of the things that we have taken a view on is that cryptocurrency should not be seen as an actual true currency. They don't really know how to classify it, but that's one of the big things. I'm sure that's really popular in this room to hear that. But anyway, so I'm happy to have the discussion. But we do believe in blockchain, and that's it.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Sorry, my mic doesn't work, so we got to share a mic here. My name is Mikhail Avadi. I'm the CEO of Try Mining. And based on the name of that company, you can guess our goal is to make the entry into mining easier. Currently, we operate a fleet of over 4,500 miners in 18 regions around the world. Our real specialty is on the software optimization side. That's where we can compete with China. We used to be in the game of hardware. We got out of that. We couldn't compete with China there. But we can compete in the software. Short and sweet.
All right, well, you heard me talk a bit already. My name is Rich Napoli, CEO of Object Frontier. We do a lot of software engineering for large corporations using advanced technology. So blockchain, of course, augmented reality, data science, machine learning, all those things. But we're doing a lot, I should say a lot. We're doing several projects in blockchain right now, prototype type things for a car manufacturer, for example, looking to create that sort of chain of custody record of the life of a car. What maintenance was done, what accidents was in. Think of like Carfax, but on the blockchain. And then we're working with a drug manufacturer, a large pharmaceutical company, to, again, certain medicine, very expensive medicine, and needs to be monitored from, make sure it's not fraud. The more expensive the medicine, the more likely it is to be created fraudulently and put on the market, and really is nothing. It's a placebo. So tracking the actual pills from the time they're manufactured to the time they're consumed is something that the pharmaceutical companies look to blockchain to be useful for.
So my name is Denis Gorovs. I'm CTO and founder of Monetizer. Personally, I have been involved in the blockchain space very, very early in 2009. Actually set up faucets to give away Bitcoin in 2009. Since then, I have started one startup in Finland, which was to facilitate microtransactions on blockchain. So my deep interest has always been how to make blockchain payments more scalable solution. As many of you probably know, blockchains lack high throughput compared to systems like MasterCard or Visa even. So right now we're bringing blockchain and cryptocurrencies to a space where microtransactions are very important in scalability, which is the gaming space, which is 27 times larger than the total space of cryptocurrencies and blockchain. So at Monetizer, we work with game developers to enable them to create their own in-game assets that are interchangeable with multiple games and allow instantaneous and fast transactions by the usage of payment channels.
Good morning, I'm Tom Savell with the CDC. let's see, I'm going to plug our business. Get your flu shot.
Flu.
It's a rough year.
Then blockchain?
That's right. Though I'm a physician practicing, I'm very lucky. I'm sort of odd duck because at CDC, my focus is on tech innovation. And I'm lucky to lead a bunch of software and hardware developers and designers to try to come up with innovative solutions that improve public health practice. And so I'll share today whatever you want to hear about with regard to what CDC's just dipping their feet in the water in this area, but I'm definitely a very passionate, loud advocate for the power of blockchain, but there's a lot of misconceptions, and I think my challenge is to help the leadership in the agency appreciate the fact that this is not frightening or scary, but really very valuable to really look into. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
All right, so first curveball. In your respective spaces, how do you see incumbent companies, governments, NGOs using blockchain differently than the disruptors in that space? And if there's a conflict, how are those conflicts playing out in their respective battle spaces? Space of regulation, space of technology standards and interoperability or lack of interoperability, public messaging, ways of user engagement, because these are not passive competitions. Trillions of dollars of the future of the economy is at stake, and big and small players, they're playing chess, not checkers.
I'll start a little bit off. That's a lot of moving parts to that question. But so one of the things we've talked about that we've seen, Goldman has started to do rating. I think I was having a conversation with a gentleman about that. But also there were some earlier folks who were starting to create funds for retail investors to invest in cryptocurrency. And you talked about government regulation. Just recently, the SEC has kind of put the kibosh on that. So that's one of the ways where we see, incumbents trying to. Now, one thing that is still available is the futures trading on cryptocurrencies. We'll see, and a lot of folks have a watch and see. One of our competitors have just blankly said we would not do any Bitcoin or Bitcoin-like things for our retail investors, right? So that's what. However, there are talks about, for instance. He showed that chart about the 3 days it takes for a transaction to get done. That's very real in my world because when I sell a position for a client, I always tell them T+3. The day you place the trade, and you count 1, 2, 3. And I literally do this every time, right? So I can remember it. And I tell you, that's when your cash will be available. One of the things that we see, if we can implement this, I don't have to tell clients T+3. I can say, hey, we're going to sell it today. Your cash will be available tomorrow. So I try to answer some of your questions. I don't know if I got to all of it, in its entirety, but that's kind of some of the things I've seen happening.
I would say, particularly in the United States, and by the way, you've got to consider that blockchain and crypto is a worldwide phenomenon. Like if you're talking about ICOs, less than 18% happen in the United States. So you have to kind of lose your North American kind of geocentric view. But particularly within the United States, the regulatory regimes, whether it's a blockchain-based system or a cryptocurrency-related system, needs to be addressed. And I've been working on this for 4 years. And you see things like the IRS has a different treatment of treating crypto as property. FinCEN, which is the Department of the Treasury, treats it as currency. The CFTC treats it as a commodity. There's 3 complete different regulatory regimes for objects of value that are transferred over blockchains. And then the SEC kicks in as well. So there's overall a lack of technological expertise and regulatory clarity, and I think that helps the incumbents quite a bit.
Well, when it comes to my business, TransferNet, we're a peer-to-peer file sharing protocol. So, the incumbents would be anyone distributing media over the internet, and they absolutely will try to shut it down, just as they do with BitTorrent, just as they did with Napster. But of course, if it's a decentralized system, there's no one point of failure. You can't really shut it down. So, BitTorrent is alive and well. It's got more users now than ever before, sharing more gigabytes per day than ever before, terabytes per day. So TransferNet is, if anybody is fighting over that space, it's BitTorrent, but obviously those two can coexist, with BitTorrent being for the very popular files that you want to get for free that have a lot of seeders, and TransferNet occupying the space for the more obscure stuff that people are only sharing in order to make money.
In the mining space, nation threats are a real threat. When you think about Bitcoin mining, about 60 to 70% of it is done in China. However, the regulation there started to crank down on it. What did they do? They started moving it to Russia. Immediately, the Russian government started to clamp down. And some of the issues that they had is they would either try to receive miners from China, where almost all miners are built, or try to send them back for repair, and they get stuck at customs. So now they're trying to think of, well, where else can we go? Because in the end of the day, all mining really is an arbitrage of power. So they got to find a place with cheap power where the regulatory, electric, where the regulatory environment is going to be friendly for the future, because moving a mining operation is not cheap, or setting one up. Right now, you have a big influx and a big demand for US and Canada. I don't know how long that's going to last. I do believe the US is going to be friendlier to mining. In the end of the day, it's a computer data center. But it has had a major effect, and there's been an exodus of large mining operations moving from country to country like nomads.
Maybe it's the beginning of colonization of Antarctica, right? Energy, cold.
Yes. Well,
whose jurisdiction?
Climate. It's got a cold climate, so that'd be nice. Except I don't know what the power costs in Antarctica are.
In terms of the disruptors versus others, I mean, as Kel said, it is being played out on a world stage. So countries are becoming actors in blockchain in different ways. So for example, Canada and Russia are both considering coming out with their own cryptocurrency backed by their government. So it's kind of crossing the chasm from being something that's avoiding authority to being embraced by authority. China, as I mentioned, is using blockchain, moving away from cryptocurrencies, but moving into the blockchain as a way to consolidate their government operations. And that's where I see a lot of the disruptors recognizing that, if you're doing this digital transformation, which is what we spend a lot of our time in my company, moving companies into the digital age, they all deal with tons of legacy systems that need to be skinny down and trimmed down from 10 accounting systems to one. And they're using sort of blockchain, the governments are doing this as well, looking at blockchain as sort of the driving force to merge down to a single set of records, and which would improve their efficiency, forgetting about what else blockchain does, but just having a single repository of truth rather than 10. We work with a lot of large corporations too, and they are faced with 10 ERP systems, inventory systems, accounting systems, and they're looking at blockchain as sort of an excuse, if you will, to hone down to one. Because if they do that, then it allows them to spend more money on the front end of digital transformation and make engaging systems and make compelling ways to connect users and products. And that's where we see some of the disruptive countries and the disruptive companies are recognizing blockchain not only for its intrinsic value, but as sort of an excuse to drive their transformation.
Something I would like to add is I hear a lot there's no central point of failure for blockchains, but I would argue that it's not always true. If you think about many of the solutions that we saw in the presentation earlier, let's say it's a supply chain or something energy related, there's always usually an entity that is involved in the blockchain. Even if you have, let's say, who owns a property as an asset on the blockchain, you still have some kind of central entity that is responsible for it. So I think it's really important that compliance and regulations are really important for this space to succeed. Many projects, you see many projects moving their businesses outside of the United States, doing an ICO through the Cayman Islands just to get away from the very strict US security laws. I think that's a wrong approach. I think if you want to build a big business that people trust, you have to follow the regulations, you have to work with the respective agencies and then find regulations and maybe change regulations moving forward to be compliant and then be trusted in this space.
Just a couple quick points. One is there's the old school vendors that are out there in the EHR, electronic health record space, and there's a ton of blockchain companies that are quickly trying to get into the space, and none of these right now are the old school Cerner and Epic. There are a lot of new ones, and there's a push to finally try to empower patients, because few of you would argue that the healthcare system is it's quite a beast, and there really is a push to say we can finally allow patients to get control of their data as they should have had all along. And I think that's where we're going to start to see a lot of change of patients getting control back of their data and saying, if a pharmaceutical company wants to actually use my data, I need something in exchange for that because there's now value in that. So I think we're going to see a lot of interesting transformations in the healthcare space, but it's a big, challenging beast nationally and obviously internationally as well.
I think the point of, it's not a question of no intermediation, it's a question of what we call neo-intermediation, that it's the new forms of it. Some will be pioneers, the incumbents will try to stay in the middle and try to stay relevant, and governments and sovereign states and their institutions are going to try to stay relevant in those domains, but it's not a 0-1 game. There will be intermediary forms. Some can be regulated. In Kel's domain, for example, continuous audit structures and things like that are going to be very important down the road that will always align with or attend to regulatory controls also. So they're great opportunities for all, both the pirates and the other side as well.
It's actually a perfect segue to my next question, which has to do with your thoughts on the benefits and challenges or risks of radical decentralization in your spaces. Right? So it gets at this kind of decision-making governance question, and there have been very high-profile cases of fracture in the communities, whether it was around the DAO, the distributed autonomous organization, or splits in the Bitcoin community over how the protocol and the future of mining is going to work and so forth. So and for the lawyers in the room, I think we're seeing a new frontier of private law that is not merely algorithms and code that may have legal backing, but new spaces for really big governance conflicts and how you figure these out. Is it majoritarian vote? Is it supermajority? Is it open source project, free to fork anytime you want? But I'm interested in thoughts on radical decentralization, take out the big guy in the middle. But what about risks or challenges that you're seeing? And those of you building new systems in particular, how are you wrestling with particular, your white paper thoughts on all right, how is the future of my technology going to be governed?
I'll start then. So this is going to seem, it's kind of tangential, but so in school we studied Thomas Hobbes, right? You guys ever read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan? And he talked about the state of nature that was solitary, cruel, right? And harsh. I remember how to write that down. And the reason we talked about that is because that's how did governments form in the first place. And the theory is that, because everybody in the beginning were all looking out for themselves, right? Okay, fairly decentralized. There was no centralized power, right? Then over time, as a society, they decided, you know what? It might be a little good if we give up some of our power just to have some guys that kind of help regulate. Because what was happening in the state of nature is that the strong were taking advantage of the weak. Now, I make the analogy to what I see here. The great thing about anything being decentralized is that everyone has some form of power and is equalized. The bad thing about that is there's always someone who's going to have some kind of advantage. Either they know more than the other person, or they're just strong, whatever the advantage is. And typically, human nature says when I have an advantage, I'm going to use that to my advantage, and it takes advantage of those. So what I suppose will happen, so that the great thing about decentralization is that, the masses have more power, right? But I think we forget why things got centralized in the first place. It was because we wanted to try to help kind of distribute that power a little more fair, and I know the anti-government saying we don't need that, but that's kind of the argument for government. So I see something similar happening in this space. For instance, some of the folks who drove up the cost of Bitcoin, right? And then the guys who got in kind of late come in and they got their shirts handed to them, right? Now I'm not saying that they did that nefariously. I'm just saying I saw that pattern, right? We've seen it before. So those are my thoughts on that. I just see similar in that space,
Well, I would make a differentiation between the technology and the social structure. Right now with current centralized systems that, technology governs our lives. And the people who control the centralized servers and software that control the technology are implicitly the leaders. So the centralization of the technology currently implicitly creates a governance or social structure that is centralized. So with the decentralized technology, you can choose. And you can have a flat structure. And I think as with any social structure, you can have teams, you can have leaders, you can have motivators. It's a social structure that can evolve on its own, but at least the technology supports, the option, as opposed to right now, our centralized technology in certain areas kind of mandate and guide the social structure or the corporate structure or the governmental structure to be, by necessity, centralized. So I think the technology gives us the option as opposed to mandating centralization.
I would add that it's just important to have some kind of a way to have efficient governance for each project, because with decentralization, one of the disadvantages is that sometimes it's very hard to implement new changes or to get consensus on how to move forward. We have seen this, for example, in the Bitcoin community, where we have the core developers that have been developing Bitcoin for a while, but there are certain parts of the community that disagree with the choices being made and are are forking the blockchain and going in a different direction. So I think for each project, it's really important to think about how do we create a decentralized system but still have an efficient way for governance. Some projects are experimenting with having that each token or each coin has a vote in the network moving forward. Sometimes there's a community fund that is managed by all token holders. Sometimes you see that people have to stake a certain amount of tokens to have a vote in how to move a protocol forward. So that's also something that we have spent a lot of time thinking about creating our protocol. So we will have a way for token holders to vote on changes. But here's always the thin line between how decentralized do you want to create it, but still have an efficient system to move forward quickly enough and implement changes quickly.
Yep. I think these idea of decentralized voting with tokens is a cool idea on the surface, and I'd love to see it work. But I think it's kind of intrinsically a little the use cases I've seen, not to speak of all of them, but some of them that I've seen are a little bit silly. Like look at the DAO, which is this basically venture fund that was on the Ethereum blockchain. It was decentralized. Everybody puts in money and then they vote on which projects to invest in. Like, okay, that sounds great, but what if you invest in a project and they don't pay dividends back to all of the voters? There's no smart contract, no blockchain mechanism forcing them to do that. Maybe they set up a smart contract and say, okay, we'll put all of our earnings into this smart contract and it'll automatically distribute to the voters, but maybe they won't. There's nothing forcing them to do that. They might make some little back channel deal with one member of the DAO to funnel all of the dividends to him, or they might just not do it at all. So, it sounds great. It's a smart contract. It enforces itself, except anytime you step away from the blockchain, it doesn't. And you see the same thing with EOS. Okay, we're going to govern the whole thing on the blockchain with votes, but nothing's going to actually force them to do that. So, I'd love to see it work, but I'm skeptical. I think a lot of these use cases actually break down a little bit once you get into the details. But with TransferNet, it's open source. Anybody can fork it, and maybe somebody will to let's say remove our token from the equation and just say, okay, it takes Ethereum now rather than the TransferNet token. That's always a consideration with an open source project. The idea is to create such a large community, such a big network, that why bother?
I think I make analogies, again, back to the early days of the internet. Everyone, especially the technologists back then, were, it's gonna, we don't need anybody controlling it. It's gonna be free. It's gonna be open. It's not gonna cost anything. So there was no, appreciation of the economics of it or the need for regulation for it. And that ruled the day for a while. And then eventually, people start to get burned by it. There've been some very notable failures, and the government starts to turn its wheels very slowly and recognize that there's a need for some regulation. The economics start to win out because in the beginning, I remember back in the late 90s, it almost like it was a suspension of reality where people were investing in things that the business model had no chance for success, but everyone said it's different this time. It's different. This is a new world and it's gonna be different. Well, the laws of money don't change, and you ultimately have to produce something of value that people are willing to pay you for. And if not, you're going to be out of business. And eventually, that started to take hold in the internet, and people started to charge for their services, or they went out of business. And I think the same thing will happen with blockchain. Is that the economics right now, well, there is some incentivization for the economics in the Bitcoin world, but there's a lot of more players. Somebody was saying last night at dinner they've invested in 70 different cryptocurrencies. I mean, there aren't going to be 70 cryptocurrencies long term, I don't think, anyway. But the market is in free form right now, and eventually it'll consolidate. Eventually there'll be enough people burned by it that there'll be a clamor for regulation, and the government will probably overstep its bounds in the beginning and then back off to something that hopefully works for everybody.
So I totally disagree. I'll bet you in 10 years there's going to be thousands of cryptocurrencies. I would argue that just as we have websites, there will be cryptocurrencies, that people may have their own individual ones. But I think I'm just going to argue, I think that may be the future of this, that it becomes as ubiquitous as like, oh yeah, I put up a website. I mean, let's just see it. That's my prediction. But it'd be fascinating if that happened.
Agreed.
At the same time, I think it's important to understand that large amounts of the tokens and projects right now, most of them will most likely fail. That we have seen also in the existing startup world. So many people believe, because the whole industry is such a bull market right now that it's almost safe to invest into anything. But most of the projects right now, they only have a white paper. They actually don't have a working product, and they sometimes even don't have a business model to actually make money out of the business. So I'm thinking about the traditional startup ecosystem where you actually have to get a small amount of funding, you build a prototype, you try to sell it. If it doesn't work out, you pivot and you try a different way. For these companies, they raise with just an idea, 20, 30 million of dollars. So it's very unlikely that all of them will succeed. So I think I agree that there's going to be many cryptocurrencies, and not only utility tokens, also security tokens, which will act more similar to traditional stocks, paying dividends and have ownership of the company. But it's really important to be safe in this market and not to invest in something, in a company that has not proven itself to have an existing business model and actually customers.
I'd like to, you need to challenge your assumptions all the time. And we use some of these terms rather loose about centralization, decentralized, and distributed. Really, and also we have the perception of immortality of currency, immortality of something. Because we have a mutable record doesn't mean that the currency structure is going to be immortal. And there are a lot of ephemeral things that will be created just because we're dealing with permanent record. And the other issue to me is allocation of decision rights. Who has what rights at what time? That's where the game is going to be very interesting down the road. And it's not humans. We're preoccupied with human decision rights. As we start getting into systemic decision rights and the sandbox, the virtual sandbox that is being played in will have allocation, just like in a plane, the pilot's got 7 systems operating, supporting it, and can allocate decision rights at different times. We're going to have that. It's not just a centralized human institutional authority.
Yeah, so on your point about it sounds like you said, the almost thousands, in my head that's what I heard, of different cryptocurrencies. I had a question/challenge with that because from my understanding, and now you guys are way more advanced on the technology side than I am, but on the assigning of value, right, don't you have a network externality effect or network effect here? So in other words, if you don't have enough people using the same currency, how does that work from an exchange standpoint? So I guess that's why I kind of have a challenge with there being thousands of different currencies, if you will. Now I see it work in the global world, right? Each country used to have its own currency, but even then, if you look at that, those European countries said, you know what, us having our own currency is not that great of an idea. Maybe we should kind of combine. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that because that's the challenge I hear with that.
Well, okay. What about Amazon coin? What about Google coin? What if it becomes a currency within a private company that's very large and becomes almost a branding coupon gift card type currency.
You're going to have something backing it, right, to ascertain
Home Depot coin.
Right.
And then they can do atomic swaps between them and other baseline reserve currencies.
But the thing is
okay,
also...
that's what I can see. So is it going to be backed by some other hardline currencies that
Well,
you're
what's
saying?
the U.S. dollar backed by?
Calcoin.
So I mean, but in the evolution of currency in the first place is to go away from saying, hey, I got 3 cows. I think my 3 cows are worth about 5 of your chickens. So am I going to say, hey, you know what, my Home Depot, I can get about 10 items over here. I'll give you this card so I can get 12 items at Walmart. I mean, you know, there has to be some kind of medium of, that's what we're getting at. Right?
I would just really quickly, a lot of the...
I'm not opposed to it.
Metallic coinage is at the local and global scale is a fairly recent phenomenon. So most of human history, it was lots of little local cryptocurrencies. I had a ledger at my pub, my shopkeeper kept track of things, families informally, and then metallic coinage was the province of long-distance trade, criminality, and armies, where you needed that thing that might be redeemable in this other place, but most human interaction, most commerce at the local level was lots of different measures of ongoing back and forth and measurement. And so I think if we have the technologies that enable the fungibility between those hyper-localized value exchanges, and I don't mean local in terms of space, I mean local in terms of connected networks. So a community of 10 people around the world as a community, then being liquid with other kinds of value exchange for other purposes. And so the monetary system that we take for granted and its precursor backed by the gold standard is an anomaly in human history. And I think and it's a fairly short anomaly. So I think we're on the beginning of some really interesting stuff. Lots of opportunities for financial innovation in that space too. I'm going to want to give the audience a chance to throw some questions at everyone. We could go for hours.
So this is for Ian. I've been involved in the data transfer space since the Napster days, and you're essentially arguing that you're creating the ultimate Napster. So are you intending to infringe on content and letting people monetize other people's rights, or am I misunderstanding what you're saying?
We're not intending to do anything. We're going to create the system and people do what they do. You know, with Napster it's very different. They were holding a central server, which was a database of who had what files and connecting them with each other. They were indirectly infringing on copyright. We're absolutely not going to be holding any database of anything. We're just creating a technology.
Right. So I suggest you review the case law.
I've seen it.
Because,
yeah, I've seen it all.
Because you're essentially doing Morpheus Part 2.
Excuse me?
You're essentially doing a later version.
Well, the big difference with Morpheus and the reason the court decided the case the way they did was because of their communication and their marketing and their internal emails to each other, you know, basically positioning this thing as a way of violating copyright.
How are you monetizing your platform?
We're not. We don't take a revenue cut for it. We basically are distributing the currency. We're charging for the upfront currency like any ICO, and that's it.
Right. So you're monetizing a platform that could primarily be used for infringement.
Yeah, I mean, so is Comcast. The internet could be used for infringement, but that is not enough to make it indirect copyright infringement.
We'll see. I suspect you'll be finding that out.
All right, so this question is kind of for all of you guys. Do you guys still see Bitcoin as a currency, or as you know, as we know, transaction fees have increased lately, and there's a view of Bitcoin of viewing it as a storage value instead of a currency. And part 2 of that question, do you guys see Tango or Hashgraph as a better version of blockchain? So that's 2 parts to that question.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tango. Yeah, the Tango.
Yeah, so like about the currency part, I would like to answer the first part is, yes, we have seen the increasing fees and slow transaction times, which didn't make it feasible as a currency exchange. I think it's important to note that during this year, the Lightning Network will be released for Bitcoin. We have seen just on a test net right now, it's running. It's still experimental software, but already 3,000 nodes running. And it's the first time that for Bitcoin, there's startups creating point-of-sale systems for coffee shops, for a restaurant. I think that's the very first time that we will actually test and to see how a cryptocurrency might work as a real means of exchange instead of a store of value. It's going to be the first experiment of actually trying to make it as a real means of exchange. As a store of value, Bitcoin has proven itself over the 10 years time. It has proven itself. There were issues with the blockchain early on. There were multiple hard forks in the very early days that many people are not aware of. So I'm very confident it's a very safe store of value or as an asset. As a currency, we will have to see how the Lightning Network will work. There's going to be issues in the very beginning and other reasons why it might not be feasible. At the same time, talking about something like a Tangle, it's a very experimental software. It's still centralized, and their network is not fully functional at this moment. I believe it's mostly going to be useful for Internet of Things devices, not as a currency, and I don't think that it's actually created as a currency, just as a more kind of to transfer information between IoT devices.
I've actually looked into the Tangle a lot, and I've actually done battles with the founder of IOTA on Reddit and Twitter. I think that this distributed acyclic graph technology, they're touting it as a blockchain killer, the next blockchain. But when it comes right down to it, I think it's pretty vulnerable to Sybil attacks, which is when somebody creates a bunch of different accounts and basically spams the network with processing fake transactions. And I think that if you really drill down and you look at the message boards and stuff, IOTA, their founders, they'll say, okay, you can't do a double spend attack. You can't do a double spend attack, and that's fine, but you can do other attacks. You can attack it in a way to shut down the network for days or months or whatever and just completely destroy the confidence in their cryptocurrency. So, maybe the Tangle is a superior blockchain. It has not been tested. It is kind of moderated by the centralized server that they control. I'm very skeptical that it will be, the next blockchain or whatever.
Oh, yes, sorry to miss you.
Thank you to the panel. This has been a great conversation, and thank you to Nicole for bringing us all together. This question is for everyone on the panel. There's been a lot of conversation around governance, and I want to talk about state-level governance for a second. The state of Nevada and Vermont in the last couple of years have passed evidentiary standards allowing blockchain-based evidence to be introduced in court. Arizona, when it went to regulate smart contracts, really paid attention to contracts created in or using the distributed ledger. Delaware's been tinkering around. Vermont has a very aggressive bill in the legislature right now trying to make itself the Estonia for blockchain. What do you need to see in state-level regulation and enabling legislation, be it Delaware or Vermont or Georgia, to make blockchain more accessible to you at the state level? What kinds of legislation do you want to see?
I'll just mention that it's great to see the states doing this, particularly Delaware, because that has national implications in terms of corporate registries. But at the end of the day, it has to be at the federal level. And I've actually been in front of the Conference of State Board Banking Supervisors, that's a national organization, and been talking. It's great to see these little islands, but just like acquiring money transmission licenses in order to be an exchange or something, you have to go to 47 different states and get a federal license. So it's great to see that, but it's not really at the end of the day that we're talking about a global technology. So when a state does it and you say, hey, I can operate within Georgia, I can operate within Delaware, doesn't mean that much when you're trying to go global and you've got other states like Washington and New York looking to see you just because you're doing something that your state permitted. So it really needs to be at a federal level.
Shouldn't have to pay taxes if I buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin. They've got to fix that threshold.
Yes. Next question on the left.
Yeah, thank you. This might be for Kel, but anyone else who wants to jump in as well. In light of the DAO collapse, $150 million collapse in the SEC ruling not to take action, but that people fear that there will be action in the future, or even classification by the SEC of securities for Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency. I was wondering your thoughts on what that DAO SEC ruling signifies for cryptocurrency funds now and in the future.
Well, I'd probably differentiate that a little bit in terms of the DAO was kind of more of a crowdfunding. So Ethereum, the actual blockchain network that was based on, was not part of the DAO, but what was referenced in, I believe it was in July or August memo by that, is how you can tell some of these tokens and classify them as either securities or utility tokens. And that's something that's still moving forward. The CFTC is involved as well as the SEC, and there's something called the Howey test, which mainly pertains, but also we've recently had a situation with an ICO out of California wherein the manner of sale was brought in, saying that the promotion of it and the guarantee of profit, even though the token itself and the model was based on it, passed the Howey test, the manner of sale actually constituted a violation. I think that's regulation that's coming into play. There are utility tokens that are pure utility, and they're done in a proper regulatory way. There's some that are in violation of it, and I know that senior law firms are in constant contact with the blockchain working group within the SEC. I think they're trying to ride a fine line between over-regulating and stifling innovation, and having the injury happen to people who get caught up in the hype and don't know what they're doing, and don't understand the risks and the technology involved, which is fairly complex at times. So it'll be interesting to see how they do that. Again, you don't want to have. We've had innovative companies leave the United States because of the regulatory environment. So I don't know exactly what they're going to do. There should, just like crowdfunding happened, there was a little bit of a settling down of that. Then, regulation crowdfunding came out and said, these are the frameworks that we'd like to see. I'd love to see something like that happen. Right now it's on a case-by-case basis, but I think it's pretty clear to most people with good legal advice on how to proceed within the ICO environment, which is what I think you're talking about. And good ones like, I think there's some here on the panel, actually have business models and work with the lawyers and do it right. And there are securitized ICOs as well, like Kodak Coin, Kodak, a public company, coming out on the T0 platform, which is the first regulated exchange that's also an ATS, which is an alternative trading system. So that is happening right now in terms of bringing out ICOs in a securitized way on regulated trading platforms. It's evolving.
Yeah. So in the interim, Howey test is probably the best advice for a case-by-case basis for people to go through the Howey test.
A highly qualified security lawyer is really the best advice.
Yes.
I also would like to add, yes, the Howey test is fine if it's a security or not. But what we have seen in the last year is everybody tries to not be a security. Everybody tries to, we don't want to follow these guidelines that the SEC has in place for many, many years. But I think for example, we were just at a conference in Miami, and then with 4,000 attendees of people in the space that are trying to innovate. What is kind of the main thoughts for next year is that let's embrace that some tokens are securities, and let's not try to hide it or try to circumvent it and try to implement something that makes it look less like a security. So just like Kel mentioned, next year we will have the first exchange for security tokens, T0. We will have the frameworks in place. There's a company called Polymath, which will do fully regulated ICOs for security tokens. So while there's still going to be a space for utility tokens for protocols where it doesn't make sense to have a security, I think there's no reason why you wouldn't do a security token otherwise. Yes, you have to follow more regulations. You're open to accredited investors only. You don't sell to the crowd. You don't buy Instagram ads trying to lure people buying into your ICO, not even understanding what it is. I think it's going to have a much better impact in this space and push the innovation forward much more quickly.
I think if you look at, in the international arena, look at venues like Singapore, where they establish much more experimental venues. Like the MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, has a lot of leeway to up to and cross borders of legal established elements. So it's like a case law development structure that they get to play in a sandbox to run experiments. And we need to do that kind of thing. The last thing I want is pre-legislation by Congress of any state, or especially our national Congress.
Question over here.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, sir. There's someone with the microphone there. Okay. Sure.
On the question of flexibility of Bitcoin and the adaptability of it and so forth, I was wondering, generally, you're pretty much in favor of the idea of increasing the megabit size of SegWit 2x, a la the New York agreement, that kind of thing, even forking off as it may need to be in things like, Bitcoin Cash, for example. I won't call it BitCash.
Any thoughts?
Gotta be off-chain. Sorry, you guys don't know that. Off-chain is the only true ultimate way to scale.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I'm sure everyone kind of...
Like I previously mentioned, there's multiple, there's the idea that even increasing block size, it only brings you so far. And the idea of buying a coffee and having this transaction automatically in a blockchain, is it really important to have each small transaction on a blockchain? Most likely not. If you have a distributed ledger that is there, that's a very secure way of storing transactions, it doesn't make sense to have very small transactions posted on the blockchain all the time. So that's why right now the Bitcoin Core implementation, the most popular Bitcoin implementation, is moving forward with the plan to have a Lightning Network, which enables transactions to happen off-chain and only be posted on the blockchain, the net value of all transactions that have happened between multiple people involved through a smart contract. And I personally feel that's the way to move forward in this space. Blockchains can only scale so far, even with the implementations later, like side chains on Ethereum, Plasma implementations. You have to think about where it makes sense to have every transaction on a blockchain, where it doesn't.
We'll take one more question right there.
Yeah, good morning. Actually, I have two questions, but this is Rajesh, and I second the similar thought, thanks for this great opportunity. There are two questions. The first one is on the technology side. Everybody pretty much in this room, I think agree about the blockchain is the big hot buzzword in the industry, right? There's a lot of technology on the platforms that are spinning up to develop a platform like a blockchain framework using Solidity, Node.js. You talk about anything from Microsoft, like blockchain as a service they are rendering in the Azure. So who is actually going to govern what kind of technology platform is suitable for blockchain kind of a concept to implement? The second question is on the business side, which is, since blockchain is a peer-to-peer based, the new business models in the recent past, which become huge success, like Uber, Airbnb, their future is going to be affected once the blockchain becomes mainstream. What kind of vision that any of you can project about the blockchain? What kind of new business models can potentially come into existence in, say, 5 years or 10 years?
To answer the first question, I think it's just a concept of free market. Whatever the better technology is what the developers are going to go to. What the developers go to is where a lot of these blockchains are going to be built, and the ones that are better and more profitable are the ones we're going to mine. So, complete cycle.
Yeah, I think blockchains are pretty crappy technologies for 99% of use cases. Usually it doesn't make sense to have a blockchain. Usually it's better to have a centralized database. And people talk about blockchains like, they always use the analogy of the internet. Well, maybe it's not like that. Maybe it's more like JavaScript or Redis or SQL, like something that nobody's going to be talking about in 10 years other than software people, because it's really, not really the best solution for most problems. You can't really have a decentralized peer-to-peer blockchain version of Uber. People say you can, but those people don't really think about all the ways that individuals try to game systems. And there could be a million different ways to game a decentralized peer-to-peer Uber in a way that would just shut the whole thing down. Not to mention the fact that Uber spends, hundreds of millions of dollars a year on marketing to get drivers, to get customers, and obviously with the decentralized platform, nobody's going to be investing that money because why would they? So I think people need to calm down about the blockchain.
Thanks for that dampening end to the panel. I'm sure we're all eager to continue dialoguing with whomever would like to. We have a break right now till 11:30, is it? Okay.
Have a break. We do have a networking break. When we come back, we're actually going to have the legal panel. So I heard some legal questions in the audience, which is fantastic. I actually loved the debate. We are at the law school, so this is fantastic as well. And I want to give our panel up here a round of applause because they did a phenomenal job. It was fun.